information operations are very interesting webs to get into. The words we use to describe our own beliefs and those of others, every word has a political connotation these days. So maybe you think you're saying one thing, but someone may be understanding you in a completely different way because of the words that you're using. And so they think they know what you're really trying to say. Plus, just for an added layer of complexity, not knowing the history of certain political movements or political theories can also cause you to draw the wrong conclusion or to have a completely different conversation from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. It opens the door for you to be swayed by influence campaigns. Our first guest tonight speaks very eloquently on this topic, and over the weekend he was at Princeton talking about words. Words like DEI, but also political theory and how we've come to be where we are right now. So join us now to discuss is Spencer Clavin, an associate editor for the Claremont Institute and the host of the Young Heretics podcast. Spencer, thanks for being here tonight.
Kara, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So talking about words and perceptions, you talk about calling someone a literal Nazi today and how it's similar in its effect to calling someone a dirty commie from just a few decades ago, as in loss of reputation and credibility in the mainstream of public square. So can you talk to us about that before we get into some of what else you talked about at Princeton?
Oh, sure. I mean, that phrase has effectively become a meme. It's lost all of its rhetorical weight, which is, of course, a tragedy given the fact that there was such a thing as the National Socialist Party. There were horrors such as the Holocaust that it's important to be able to talk about and condemn. But in the wake of that history, leftists have seized that name, that moniker, and used it basically to smear anybody even remotely to the right of them. And that's how you get to the point where calling somebody a Nazi almost has no meaning anymore. I think we owe a lot of this to our friend Herbert Marcuse, who is a member of the Frankfurt School, a sort of Marxist-inflected group of scholars and critical theorists, who wrote an essay in the 60s called Liberating Tolerance. And Marcuse's idea is that true toleration doesn't actually mean being open to all sorts of viewpoints. It means being tolerant toward the left and intolerant toward the right, because basically anybody that opposes anything to, say, the right of Karl Marx is effectively a fascist and a literal Nazi. We're now seeing how this has taken over in programs like DEI and how people are getting labeled with things like domestic terrorist when really all they're doing is protesting at school boards. And what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong, as you're saying? With Marcuse, I hear, well, I don't want to oversimplify, but I guess I'll have to just for the sake of, having about 10 minutes with you on the clock here. But you hear some who will say on the right that Marcuse of the Frankfurt School, that they have a huge influence over why we have cultural Marxism, as they'll term it today, wokeism, as maybe it's more commonly known, and why it runs everywhere. It's running rampage. It's the long march through the institutions. Then you hear others on the right take more nuanced look, and they say, well, no, it's a little bit different, and the woke stirs up today don't have really any bearing on the Marxist of yesteryear, yet they do kind of use similar language, and of course they do look back to those, and they do see themselves perhaps as the intellectual heirs of those Marxists. But how much influence would you put on Marcuse, his thoughts in the Frankfurt School on what we're seeing today, especially with DEI and some of this other woke nonsense that's really everywhere?
Well, I think it's a huge mistake to discount the Marxists, the Frankfurt School, the postmodernists, the critical theorists, that whole intellectual movement of the cultural left. It has had an enormous influence, even if the people on the ground don't always realize it. I mean, you remember when Patrisse Cullors of Black Lives Matter said, "We are trained Marxists." They weren't kidding around. And this philosophy that in order to take control of the narrative, you have to paint everybody to the right of you as a potential fascist, shut them up, forbid them from speaking, use violence, indeed, if necessary. All of that arises directly out of these terrible, terrible ideas. Of course, there are other factors at play in an American context. I think that the way that civil rights law has been manipulated and weaponized to reach into people's places of business and indeed sometimes even their homes and to apply these unfair standards, that's all been a part of it. But you don't get here, I don't think, without that long march through the institutions and without the intellectual engine that really came out of guys like Marcuse, Adorno, Foucault, those sorts of people.